Aye.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are just about a minute or two away from beginning, so please hang tight for a moment. Maybe grab a quick snack, and we will begin momentarily.
Eddie.
Dr. Shor, how are you, sir?
Okay. You know, it's still, even though I pre-registered, it still asks me to register again.
You know, the same thing happened to me, so it's not just you.
Okay.
One of those little bugs we'll work out next time, but I see 31 folks have joined us successfully, so one way or another we got in here. I've got 5:31 by my clock. Would you like to get started?
1 more minute and we'll go. And then
That's
you
good.
can start.
Perfect.
I guess it's 32 folks. About 32, Eddie?
That is 33.
Okay. We can
Very
go
good.
ahead.
Well, let's get the show on the road here. So welcome everyone to our VCSQI spring quarterly meeting. Thanks all for being with us tonight. Just hope everyone is staying safe and well out there tonight. May marks the 1-year anniversary from us doing virtual quarterly meetings. So while we definitely miss you in person, we sincerely hope everyone is staying safe and healthy out there. We have a couple quick reminders just in terms of Zoom etiquette. I think people are pretty familiar with everything at this point, but just in terms of ensuring a smooth meeting, to please mute yourselves if you're not speaking. And there's a whole host of interactive features down at the bottom on the Zoom window and in the participants tab. Feel free to unmute yourselves. This is an open meeting. This is not a webinar. It's an open Zoom meeting. So your engagement and interaction is crucial, either via the chat box or feel free to unmute yourselves if you're comfortable doing that. Again, we encourage everybody to please speak up and have open Q&A and discussion. In terms of CME credits, we are offering CMEs to everyone in attendance tonight. Those will automatically be recorded based on your Zoom registration, and we will send out the info after the meeting this evening. You just need to complete the quick survey on the VCU server, and then you should have an option to claim your credits. Tonight's agenda, we will start out with Dr. Shor on the board and quickly move to our committees, work groups, and partners. A number of exciting initiatives we'd like to update folks about. We will then move to Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Kevin Lobdell, who will give us an update on the exciting Perfect Care collaboration. Next, we'll look at some data and progress in our quality initiatives from myself and Gyula. Lastly, but not least, we will have a talk by Chris and Dr. Brackbill from Winchester on obesity, amiodarone, and AFib. We'll wrap everything up with some closing comments, group discussion, and ideas regarding our future directions. Dr. Shor, I will pass it over to you for some updates from the board.
Thank you so very much, and thank everyone for being on the call for our quarterly meeting. I want to emphasize Eddie's point about staying safe. I feel like we're close to the end zone and we need to still push ahead. The board met, a couple highlights. We went over the financials, which remain good and quite stable. Among the priorities we had set include cath film review. We talked about the fact that we've signed the contract for MACPAC, which is the review system through the Maryland Quality Network with Johns Hopkins and University of Maryland. We will initially have 2 centers, hopefully end of Q1, and then are going to have a staggered rollout thereafter to include all of the other participating centers. And hopefully this will be better than our last iteration. Also provides us some opportunities to do some collaborative research with them, and I've had some conversations ongoing, and hopefully that will take place as well. The next is the aggregate registries, and the 2 major issues were the STEMI registry with VHAC, Virginia Heart Attack Coalition, and TVT. As you know, when the relationship between ACC and AHA regarding the registry split, there was a fracture in the data. And this is an attempt to put the statewide STEMI network data together in a meaningful way. And we are very close to that. We have 5 pilot centers at this point with chest pain, MI, and guidelines, Get With The Guidelines, collaborating with ARMUS. So that's a very exciting development, and hopefully at our next meeting, we'll be able to present some of that data. And something that's been an ongoing issue is actually getting the TVT data. We have been waiting on data specifications from the ACC and NCDR, and we are told that we will have that by end of Q1. This has placed us in a holding pattern waiting for that, but we are excited in anticipation of getting that information. The next initiative is a variety of work groups, and we'll hear more about those, but we'll be sending some surveys, have sent surveys out regarding both the shock work groups and work group and AKI, and we'll hear more about that, but that is very, very welcoming news. The next item that was identified as a priority is healthcare disparities. We have a huge amount on our plate. This is not something we wish to lose the momentum with, and we'll be reaching out to folks to help with this. The healthcare disparities both is a diversity, equity, and inclusion within the health system, including the culture created in the system, as well as the delivery of care. And so we're thinking about those as 2 separate items as we try to approach. The decision from the board was to create a work group to develop some of the initial questions, and we will reach out to some other specialists that can add some insight for us. Lastly, we have as an initiative and objective is same-day discharge, and this is ever present and important. It is taking some time, and we will get the data as it develops. We'll have some data to present, and hopefully this will be something we can do in with greater energy in the second half of the year. And I think that is a brief summary and overview of the board meeting. If any of the other board members want to add anything for context, or Eddie, Sherry to add anything else, please feel free.
Yes, that is all the updates that we have. We'll have more committee updates as we progress, but we always also want your feedback on any initiatives that are more important to you so we can make sure we continue to add value to your membership. And I'm going to load. Eddie's having a little bit of technical difficulty, so we're switching things over a bit. Okay, and actually first we're going to go into our our committees. So Eve, I see you're online. Would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm here, Sherry. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much. I just wanted to do a short report about some of the things that we're considering on the perfusion group, subgroup. We are continuing to do our membership drive. Currently, we have 8 active centers, and we're pleased with that, but we're always looking for 100% of our cardiac surgery centers. So as we can continue to drive towards 100% membership, we appreciate anybody's ability to connect us. If you suspect that or know that your perfusion group is not represented within the VCSQI, please reach out to us, to me or Sherry, and we will do our best to be in touch with the perfusion chief or your group and try to help them understand why we think it's important that they contribute to our data collection and our discussion. So thank you for that. Mike Brown will talk a little bit more later about the AKI survey, but we're also pleased at the results that we got from our perfusion specific practices survey. Again, with 8 active members, 8 centers with active members, we got 7 responses. So we're pleased with that response rate. Of course, we would like an N, greater, but that's very successful, I think. We got some good data. Mike's survey was well put together and specific. And I think that we have a good snapshot of what our practices are now, which is what we were looking for. So I just wanted to point out that. Mike will go into it a little bit, but we're pleased to have anybody join us next week. We have perfusion group meetings on the schedule next Tuesday, and we will dive into all of these slides in depth and discuss what the results are with our members. And please join us if you're interested in getting some more in-depth information about it. I would say that broadly, the topics that we discussed had to do with hemodilution, crystalloid use, mean arterial pressure on bypass, adequate cardiac index on bypass. So pretty interesting subjects. Then I wanted to talk a little bit and make sure that everybody knows that we have other initiatives that we're going to be working towards. Those initiatives were decided by our members. And so in addition to AKI, we're going to be discussing goal-directed perfusion and the performance assessment and EMR integration, hopefully using some EPIC tools, but we're going to work on that. We have one member that's currently in the process, and we hope to join him and form a stronger voice and a stronger body, and maybe be able to produce a report that's useful for perfusion to assess our performance and guide us in better or best practices. So again, just want to invite anybody that's interested to a meeting on March 16th. We're having it at 2 different times, noon and 5:30, since we think that would be best for our members to be able to come to one or the other or both. I think that's it, Sherry. I think that's all I wanted to hit on today. Thank you for the chance to let everybody know what the perfusion group is up to.
Excellent. Always a pleasure. And if you all want to check your chat, if you're interested in joining the March 16th meetings, I've sent you links to join or register for with either one of the sessions that you choose. Thank you again, Eve, as always. We appreciate you. And up next, we have our AKI work group. We have 3 champions Work group, Mike Brown, perfusionist from Mary Washington. From Winchester, and Dr. Deemer. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay?
Perfect.
Super. So yeah, we started with our AKI task force or work group this past January, really kicked off our efforts really to try to start off with some information gathering. I think that was our key focus. And we put together, as Eve mentioned, we put together a perfusion survey, which we're pretty excited about the data that we got back and the response. We also got some information from the Maryland Perfusion Society, which I think will be helpful as well, just to see what other folks are doing. We also submitted or created and submitted cardiology and a cardiac surgery specific surveys, which Dr. Demer was very helpful in getting put together and sent out. And we're looking at all that data as well, just to assess what other programs are currently doing and seeing what their best practice efforts are. We've reviewed a lot of the VCSQI, renal failure and AKI data, the current data we have for CV surgery and cardiology. We're looking for trends and opportunities for improvement. Again, we're collating the results of the 3 surveys, and our expectation is to hopefully get that information out to you guys at the next meeting once we can kind of make some headway through the data and meet together as a group to see how best we can present that to you. We're really looking for trends and outcomes, practices, and other folks' protocols. And so if you haven't had the opportunity to participate in the CV surgery or the cardiology survey, we very much encourage you to do so, because I think whatever you're doing at your program or not doing at your program really will be helpful to us to establish where our baseline is in VCSQI. We're looking at literature, AKI literature, and all the peer review journals. There's so much out there to pour through and look and try to gain some ideas and some opportunities for improvement within VCSQI. But the other thing that we're really anticipating is the STS, SCAI, and AMSEC task force consensus on AKI. And from my understanding, Dr. Lobdell attended one of our meetings a few weeks ago, and that's actually in the process of publication. I think that will be very foretelling for us. When we started in October at Mary Washington with our AKI subgroup, we quickly found out that there was a national effort, and we kind of pumped the brakes because we really wanted to see what their recommendations would be, and we really didn't want to reinvent the wheel. But we're moving forward from a VCSQI standpoint to get to get an idea of where we stand right now with practices across the state. And I think that hopefully when we get our data together, we've already isolated pre, intra, and post-operative opportunities in CV surgery and in cardiology, as well as perfusion. And we're hoping that we can dovetail those expectations or better yet, those recommendations with what STS is going to recommend. We're also working with other quality initiatives. We're looking at some work that COAP has done. And we're also looking at other technology and testing that can be done. I know that we've looked at the AKI testing, predicting, I'm drawing a blank at the exact test. I don't have it in front of me, but we've looked at that for the last few years at VCSQI. But there's also some other hemodynamic monitoring equipment out there now. There's the Hemisphere, which has the Acumen IQ. I know our facility is looking at it. I understand there are other facilities in Virginia that's either adopted it or they're in the process of trialing it. That really is critical in predicting hypotension, which has been a big predictor of AKI in the intra-op and the post-operative period. And so our big goal is just to develop some best practice recommendations. And I really think that the recommendations that STS has put out with respect to blood conservation and AFib prophylaxis and antibiotic stewardship and extubation, VCSQI has done a great job of dovetailing those into our efforts and really leading the nation in best practice. And that's the goal of this committee. I wish we were moving a little bit more quickly, in all honesty, with being able to get to get something to you, but I think that the due diligence that we're taking will probably pay dividends and being patient and knowing what is the best thing to do so that we get we kind of get a consensus among members in VCSQI to move forward with that. So that's kind of where we are at this point. And if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to ask them now, or you're welcome to email me as well. I will say that Chris Systma from Winchester is my co-chair. We've had a number of physicians that have called in to our meetings, Dr. Demmer, Dr. Shor, Dr. Lobdell, and if there's other physicians that are interested, I know that there's some there's an anesthesiologist at our practice that's been behind the scenes helping me, and if there are other physicians at any of the VCSQI facilities that are interested in participating, very much welcome their input. So thank you guys for the opportunity to speak. And I apologize for the massive headphones, but I have a cat that has dementia, and if she comes into this room, it's going to sound like the FSCAI, so that's why I'm wearing them. Guys, have a good night. Enjoy the meeting.
Always a pleasure, Mike. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Okay. Up next, we have an update for our SHOC work group. Dr. Tehrani, are you with us? Okay. I will give an update, and Dr. O'Brien, if you're here as well, if you wouldn't mind giving an update on the correct side. So as it relates to the SHOC management work group, we have deployed the survey to about 44, 45 PCI centers across the state. We've obtained contact information for 38 of the 44 or 45 PCI centers across the state. To date, we have received approximately 15 or 16 responses. We are actively scouting to receive more responses because we want to get an accurate assessment of where we are as a state as it relates to managing SHOC. If there's organizations or facilities that do not have a SHOC practice, management practice, we want to know that as well, and it's indicated in the state. We have solicited the support of members through VHAC, as well as our data managers to help us to obtain additional feedback. Dr. Tehrani, he prepared a nice slide for us, but before we go there, Dr. O'Brien, are you online with us?
I am, yes, thank you. I can kind of, did you have anything else for cardiogenic shock from a survey standpoint? Thank you. Yeah, I think it's off to a good start. It's hard, as we all know, to get the contact information and then to get the surveys out and the surveys back. But we're already starting to get some interesting data trickling in. And so I'll just kind of put a little plug in, check your spam inboxes and things like that. If you don't have the survey, if you know it hasn't been filled out, we can tell you if your institution's filled it out. So if you're not sure, just let us know. We'll get that back out to you again. The point of the survey, we try to keep it as painless as possible, is to really get a first look at the state in terms of shock management. So you might be a transplant LVAD center with all the latest, great stuff to use, or you may have just a very rudimentary sort of STEMI center, PA catheter, ship the really sick ones. We want to know that as well, because I think before we can start to look at how to improve shock outcomes in the state of Virginia, we have to get a first look at what the practice patterns are. So that you're seeing that slide is kind of a quick sort of vision. This is Dr. Tehrani's slide here about, basically the systems of care for shock. Looks very familiar to those of us who have worked in the STEMI world and have been STEMI activists all these years. And to the right is a very preliminary organizational map of Virginia. But again, it's a start. at trying to improve systems of care for shock treatment across our state and hopefully improve mortality, things like that. So Sherry, I know I'm pinch hitting a little bit on the cardiogenic shock stuff. Do you want to go to the next slide? Because it dovetails with this as well.
Sure.
Well, actually, it doesn't, because it's the next group. But I will. I will come back if you want, and I will talk a little bit more about VHAC and how it relates to shock and where we're going from there.
Okay.
We probably have time now if you.
Okay. Skip
wanna
ahead.
Just yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Perfect. So I want to give a quick update from the Virginia Heart Attack Coalition. I think most of the folks involved are aware of who we are. We've been around since 2008, and we are dedicated to improving the timeliness and access to care for STEMI across the state of Virginia. And Dr. Tehrani approached us about joining forces with, or really starting the Virginia Cardiogenic Shock Initiative along the same lines. And it was just, I thought, a wonderful idea and fit perfectly with our mission for quality improvement with acute coronary syndromes. Next slide. So we've had, like everybody else, we've had to really change how we do business during the COVID pandemic. We used to have these big, wonderful state meetings with like 100 people and great speakers and networking and all that, but that unfortunately has been a casualty of COVID. So we've gone to virtual state meetings, which have actually been well received. We had our third such meeting on cardiogenic shock and had over 100 participants. It was a wonderful hour program. We had presentations from Dr. Tehrani from Inova Heart and Vascular, and also my partner here at Centra, our CHF leader, Dr. Steve Renison. And what we did was we looked at not only the quality improvement aspects of shock and what the vision was for the Cardiogenic Shock Initiative, but really went back and they gave a great didactic presentation that was geared towards really EMS providers through the ER, cath lab, to the CCU, and was a wonderful review of the data on shock, survival, modalities used, and just the basic physiology. So it was a great presentation. We were very, very grateful to those two speakers. Next slide. So Eddie and Bob have already touched on the joint registry that we're very excited about with ARMUS, synthesizing data from chest pain MI and get with the guidelines, because as you know, the ACTION registry sadly went away several years ago, and that was really the backbone of VHAC. We had gone from 7 centers to almost 40 PCI centers on ACTION. We had wonderful apples to apples comparison data that we could show at all of our meetings. We watched first medical contact to balloon times under VHAC in the state of Virginia. I don't know if someone's little echo there. We watched the FMC to balloon times in the state of Virginia decline from the mid 90s down to the mid 70s. So we were really rolling. Not having that registry was a step backwards, but I'm excited that we are a step closer now to getting that integrated registry through ARMUS, through VCSQI and VHAC. So I think we heard tonight that we're up to 5 centers that are kind of beta testing it for us. So hopefully by the next meeting, we'll have more to present, both here and with our virtual state meeting. So lots going on with the VHAC, lots going on with shock. I would kind of say, just as a, while I've got everybody, just a sort of a quick plea to the state, we definitely are in need of STEMI leaders in all of our regions. I think COVID has pulled a lot of our good people away, a lot of other concerns, a lot of other priorities now with healthcare systems. We do know from NCDR data that STEMI care has suffered during COVID. It not only because Share, I don't know if there's a way to there we go. Thanks. So we really need to keep our eye on the ball for some of these other disease states. So just real quick before I wrap up, that is the way we have organized the state. And those little balloons there are the PCI centers. So in some regions of the state, we have big, robust STEMI regional councils that are just rocking along. And in other areas, we've lost some of our leaders. So if you have any interest in joining VHAC, and this is an appeal to EMS, nursing, administrators, cardiologists, ER, whomever, please reach out to me. We are definitely in need of help and leadership to further quality of care and help our STEMI patients in different regions of the state. And that's our information there. Join, like, follow us, social media, website. I'm happy to share my contact information, or you can reach out to Sherry and Eddie, and we'd love to have you on board. So that is a lot of activity in a couple of minutes there. Sherry, I have nothing else. I think that's it. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Okay, so we're going to go back just a little bit to give you an update on our Enhanced Recovery, or ERAS work group. As you all know, Dr. Kevin Lobdell, Lieutenant Colonel, has been helping us lead this charge. Recently, we have called upon Bethany Sarosiek from UVA. She is the ERAS coordinator of the organization, and she holds so many roles, so many different approaches as it relates to the tactical approach of implementing enhanced recovery guidelines. Earlier in the month, Bethany met with the group and pretty much gave her overview of how she implemented ERAS within UVA and some tactical approaches of how we can move this initiative to the next level. So Bethany partnering with Dr. Lobdell. Dr. Lobdell will still continue to serve as our strategic advisor, and we're looking forward to taking this to the next level. If there's anyone who's interested in joining this partnership, this effort, or just want to provide some feedback or some tools that will be useful to this group, please don't hesitate to contact either Dr. Lobdell, Bethany, Eddie, or myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sherry. This is Eddie. I'll just say one additional piece, which is the ERAS cardiac virtual meeting was held last weekend. And our hope is to pick the brains of Dr. Lobdell and some of the other great speakers at that event in the way of a Q&A or slide share, understand different ways of understanding kind of what the latest and greatest in ERAS are. So perhaps when Dr. Lobdell speaks up next, we can ask him about ERAS as well.
Thank you, Eddie. And I think we're on research and writing group.
Yes, so our last update from our research and writing committee, chaired by Dr. Cotter at VCU, we've had 2 recent publications in the Annals of Thoracic Surgery, variability in utilization of concomitant AFib ablation during mitral valve surgery. Some of you will remember Hunter's survey and analysis of AFib ablation and ongoing projects to try and increase ablation rates during MVRs. So please look out for that publication. Let us know if you'd like us to send you a copy. The second piece is the burden of tricuspid regurgitation in patients undergoing CABG. So 2 of the first publications in Annals were by VCSQI members this year. Just wanted to highlight those. We have 4 ongoing projects in the committee right now, including our wonderful Ms. Chris Seitzman's presentation on AFib, obesity, and amiodarone. So stay tuned for more on that later. So next up, it is my pleasure to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Kevin Lobdell from Atrium Health and Perfect Care in North Carolina. Dr. Lobdell will give us a glimpse of what is the future of cardiovascular care in our vision, and more about the Perfect Care Collaborative and how we're going to work together with VCSQI and Perfect Care moving forward. Dr. Lobdell.
Thanks, Eddie. Eddie, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Thanks, Robert and Alan and Sherry, Eddie, and the rest of the team in Virginia. It's been a great journey. And this talk, I think, helps to revisit some of the things we've talked about in the past and celebrate the data sharing agreement. And hopefully what people will see is that as we come, we're offering some novel platforms to try to help improve care and share with you all. So I think this is going to be great. Next slide. Great book for those to read that haven't seen it already. The Future's Faster Than You Think. It's really about the network world and the 6 Ds of exponential technology. That is digital information, deceptive increase in scope and utilization, disruption, demonetization, dematerialization, and democratization of information. Alan would probably reinforce some of these things as strategic goals from the STS, but they're certainly prominent in our world. And I think Perfect Care is a great example of some of the work that relates to this. Next slide. As those that have seen it before will remember, with Perfect Care, we have a digital health kit that includes a Fitbit fitness tracker, a scale, a sphygmomanometer, blood pressure cuff, and we also have the ability to, via Bluetooth, with which these are all connected, incorporate things like oxygen saturation and any of the other novel biometrics. Next slide. Also, the platform gives us the ability to use audio-visual visits. Next slide. And with the help of our technology partner, Carium, what we've done is map out exactly what our planned visits look like over a 12.
Like a lot of the same kids from the last team.
Thanks, Sherry. Map out the basically 90-day pathway for our patients after surgery. And that fits, as everybody would imagine, with bundled care or at-risk sort of contracts. And our surveys will go out to a year for the patient-reported outcome measures. Next slide. This is what that interface looks like on Carium, the app for the patients. Each of these are separate sort of screenshots, but you'll see that there's a health feed, surveys, appointments, things like their biometrics, in this case, blood pressure. The next slide just shows the appointment scheduling. And then here is what the clinician sees. So our nurse navigators, for instance, being able to see both individual patient results and the alarms based on the parameters we set. But the top left is to depict what it looks like when you're looking at a population and say blood pressure, if they're in control or not. For what it's worth, we've now started to use this same platform for our heart failure and just simply remote management of cardiac patients in the cardiology world during the COVID environment. So it's been a great sort of scalable solution that we started in cardiac surgery. Next slide. Oops, sorry for that animation. As we've talked about briefly, we've created scorecards with the help of sort of historic precedent as well as the ARMUS platform, pathways, protocols, mapped out that peri-procedural journey, and now spreading the collaboration. And we're just thankful to have the opportunity to share with you. Next slide. Here's a look at our first 18 months. We did get a report today through the end of February, and it's now about 360 patients. But in that first 18 months with this Perfect Care remote monitoring platform, 308 patients, 1,216 virtual visits, 375 interventions, meaning, you know, when we're changing medications and doing different things for our patients, 94 avoided office visits, 69 avoided emergency room visits. You see a couple of depictions there, and the PROMISE survey, for instance, at the bottom right is showing you what it looked like pre-op and then post-operatively. And the great thing is both mental and physical scores are improving. Next slide. Here's a look at the ARMUS dashboard and some of the results. Of note, and I'll describe that in the next slide, is the marked improvement in readmissions and length of stay. Next slide. Here was our isolated coronary, so that you're focusing on one homogeneous population. In that period, we'd enrolled 88 patients in Perfect Care that had CAD only. And what you'll see there is there were no deaths, no stroke, no prolonged event, a reoperation. our postoperative length of stay was 5.1 days versus the 7.9 in the average, 6.9 for total versus 9.5 for the benchmark in the STS, and a readmission rate less than half. Clearly, you know, the lack of complications help, but we think during this COVID era, you know, this technology gives us more confidence as well as the patients to let them go home early and certainly, you know, reduce the risk of coming back. So while this is not a, you know, prospective randomized study, or for that matter, you know, risk adjusted at this point, we'll get some more numbers. It does show the feasibility, and it shows some very promising trends. Next. Again, we're pleased to be able to share with you and others like the Enhanced Recovery Society in improving the spread of this network. As you all know from your work, as well as New England and Michigan, these collaboratives have been demonstrated to improve outcomes. So we're, again, excited to join you. Next slide. This is just, again, a look at that. Top right is our screenshot of the scorecard. Bottom right is what Eddie and Sherry and I have worked on in mocking up the data sharing agreement. So what we'll do is share Virginia and the Perfect Care collaboratives as a big network. And in the typical death complications, length of stay, readmission, some of the process measures like transfusion rates and so forth. And it's a good way to start the journey. And as we enhance the ARMUS platform, we'll take the next steps in sharing. So recapping that data sharing, there's the clinical data from the STS. We've been collecting the financial data as you have. We've got some things to work out with ARMUS. We've got the audio-visual remote monitoring, pulling in the biometrics via the digital health kit, the PROMIS survey for patient-reported outcomes, and we're also now working on what I call CROs, or clinician-reported outcomes. Next slide. Here's a look at that. This is done in concert with Arena Labs. This is their beta version, but using Whoop, the band that's used for fitness and performance. We're now developing this platform, and I function as a consultant with them to measure biometrics for caregivers, as well as the surveys that you see sort of there on the left, and coach them. And the idea is that we'll work on understanding their performance and challenges, with the idea that we can mitigate the risk of burnout, bolster people's, you know, well-being, and be better teammates. Next slide. I mentioned the protocols and pathways. We've worked on 26 different standard practice routines. This is just one example of OR to ICU handoff. We intend to have all of that be open source. So those documents and approaches will be available as we collaborate. And Eddie mentioned the ERAS Society. We met, and one of the reproducible items in the feedback that we got was that people wanted tangible things like these standard practice routines. So I think it's important to go from just talking about things to actually having work product, and we've done a lot of that. So we're really excited to be able to join with you and share what we've done. Next. So in summary, you know, this computerized network world is really disruptive with exponential technologies, and we've been able to incorporate them. We really look forward to this improvement network with you in Perfect Care, and also ERAS. And we've had some preliminary talks with Maryland. So I think that's exciting. We'll have more patients and experts and accelerate the learning and improvement that we do together. The technology that we use is feasible, and at this stage, it certainly looks like it's enhanced outcomes in our multi-hospital efforts. And I sound like a broken record, but we're just thrilled to be able to join you. You guys have such a esteemed panel and rich history that it's exciting to be able to participate. Thank you, Sherry, Eddie.
Thank you, as always.
Kevin, this is Alan Spear. Thank you very much for this overview, and what a phenomenal journey you've been on when you first presented in concept where this was 15 months ago, 18 months ago. It seems longer, but I know it's not. And I mean, with your 350 plus patients, you've operationalized that theory, which is always such a inspiring thing. The question that I have that, and I'm the complementary aspects of this notwithstanding, is your results are uncommon. The stroke rate, I mean, if you go through the results, all of those are excellent when compared with the STS outcomes. And a little bit of a loss is to understand how the perfect care model and the hospital course model is impacted by this. I fully understand and am admiring of the post-discharge benefit with weights as reflective of failure and being able to modify the medical regimen, particularly the diuretics and the heart failure approach, as well as heart rates, and the improvement that that's given us with our virtual meetings, which is a side benefit of the pandemic. But how do you equate perfect care with your improved results for the hospitalization course?
Yeah, it's a good question, Alan. Thank you. So I may not have done a good job of emphasizing sort of the pathway protocol or standard practice routines, but what we did in the very beginning, before we were even remote monitoring, was get the team together. And we didn't really spend a lot of time on things that we could disagree on or things that required a lot of literature search, but we just said, what is it that we all do that we think is important that we can codify? And that became the 26 standard practice routines. So that's everything from a goal sheet to a handoff from the operating room to the ICU to the way we're going to manage patients in the ICU with goal-directed therapy or atrial fibrillation, et cetera, et cetera. And we think because of this rich journey that we've been on, you know, as an institution like you have as a collaborative, that having that shared mental model and that rigor and discipline around how you do work on a daily basis correlates with improved outcomes. So specifically, like the death and the major complications that you describe. The and here becomes having the competencies to employ the platform to remotely monitor patients, measure their biometrics and so forth, pick up issues early and solve problems that patients have so that they don't end up coming back to the office. They don't come back to the ED. They don't get readmitted. But to your point, we've done some of the calculations to prove this. We think we're going to need about 750 patients to be able to propensity score match these and demonstrate that the perfect care patients compared to, you know, historic controls would have better outcomes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just have one more question though, and then I'll, because we could talk all night as we have over the years. But as you're looking at your 26 protocols and standard approaches, within your one center, you have control over that. As you've expanded that, whether it's comparing it with us or the New England group or the Michigan group, there is relevant disparities on the extubation protocols, AKI, AFib, bleeding. What can we do jointly to move closer to the center in such standardization? Or as a side bar of that, does it matter? I mean, I think for so along the way with us, it doesn't matter what you did about transfusion, just do something. You know, whether you use amiodarone or not, doesn't matter. Just do something, you know, within your center and then let the results sort it out. So are the protocols what's driving it, or do you think that as long as we can agree on treating these different post-op or post-MI, because I'm sure this can spill over in with our cardiology as well. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. What you're really getting at is sort of the journey that you and I have been on the last couple of decades of how do you learn and improve. And one way to look at that graphically is if you thought about the distribution of outcomes, whether it was Virginia or Michigan or the STS for that matter, what we'd like to see is a higher peak and a narrower distribution, right? That people are all doing very well. I think that the pragmatic thing, though, that I've learned with time is that, as you allude, programs do things differently, and we really have to meet them where they are and work towards increasing that peak and narrowing the distribution. So my pragmatic approach to that would be to say, here's what we do. And if somebody, for instance, is doing better with AKI than we are, then I try to understand what they're doing and see, where it differs from us and how we could incorporate. If somebody thinks that we've done something particularly well, they can plagiarize with pride. We've tried to document those things and share. But if I was able to reduce all of this to the exact variables, that correlate with the outcomes, I think you and I would have reached the point where we really have incredible data. We've got incredible analytics, and it's probably long after you and I are no longer participating in these efforts. Does that answer it, Alan?
Thank you, Kevin. Yes.
Thanks. Great questions. Sherry, Eddie, anything else?
Any other questions for Dr. Lobdell?
Eddie, did you want to
This has
touch
been great.
briefly? You'd mentioned the enhanced recovery.
Yes, I was going to ask
Absolutely.
about that as well.
Kevin, before you get to that, have you collaborated with, or are you rolling this out in the cardiology silos? Or have you looked at the PCIs or your STEMIs to use your systematic approach in cardiovascular disease, not just surgery?
So the answer is a qualified yes. Our cardiologists, have a very advanced sort of effort of quality and so forth, but they're somewhat separate. And if you're asking about the platform for, say, Perfect Care, it would be, again, a qualified yes. We decided to start with heart failure because of the volume of patients and the dollar figures associated with it. And it's a strategic imperative of our system, but we do look to incorporate these technologies. It's really just a matter of time. And probably much like you, COVID has taken over priority for everything. Thank goodness, vaccines are rolled out and the incidence is decreasing in the community. Now that people have seen this, I think there's real potential to spread at a accelerated rate.
Thank you.
I believe Beth from our Washington had a question.
Yes, I wanted to hear more about what you learned from the VCSQI from the ERASC thing that we had here this past weekend. If you could just give us some highlights about that, we'd love to hear it.
Yes, absolutely. It was, I think, an unmitigated success. We had 1,400 plus people from 51 different countries. For those that didn't participate, what we did is we took the board to Houston Methodist and we worked out of the studio they have. So think of it like being an ESPN-like phenomenon. We'd have the various clinical experts / board members sit as a panel, introduce speaker. We had approximately 10-minute talk recorded, which then was followed by about 20 minutes of discussion on key topics in enhanced recovery. We had an incredibly engaged community. We used Slido as an interactive thing so people could bring questions in, and we've already got the early feedback, which was terrific. Some of the very tangible things we've learned, or people want to know much more, like Alan described, how did this happen? Give me the tools. Tell me exactly what you did. So not as sort of theoretical. The interesting themes to me, though, would really be around key things like goal-directed therapy, blood transfusion, hemoconcentration, early extubation. We really didn't talk at all about glycemic control. I think that's sort of in the rear view mirror for most people. They're doing it well. But there's a real interest now in engaging the patients and using technology as we have. And then also as simple as which ERAS elements do we need to begin to include in custom fields so that we can incorporate them into our understanding and learn from that and then correlate with our success or lack thereof, which fits very much with what Alan's saying. Like, if you're doing these things, how do you know they correlate or do not correlate with success? So I think those are the key takeaways, and happy to answer any other questions.
Kevin, is that ERAS symposium available? Either we could subscribe or look at it individually, or have it reviewed at one of our quarterly meetings, and when you get back from active duty, you could help us with that. Is that I don't want to impose, but I mean, is that something that's available?
Yeah, absolutely. We've recorded these things. We're in the process of, managing the archiving and then planning on how we'll roll that out. But yes, absolutely. We'll figure out the best way to be able to share that, and we'll do that with the team.
Thank you, Dr. Spear. You beat me to it. And thank you, Dr. Lobdell. That's wonderful. We appreciate you.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. It's been an incredible journey.
Thank you again, Dr. Lobdell, and we will look forward to sharing data and best practices with you going forward.
Thanks.
So next up, I'm going to provide some updates from our CathPCI database, as well as different quality initiatives that we are working on, and some of which have been mentioned already. So without further ado, I will jump right in. Dr. Shor had mentioned our refresh of the angiographic film reviews. So we're excited to announce that we have a new partner, which is the Maryland Academic Consortium for Percutaneous Coronary Intervention, Appropriateness and Quality. So that's a mouthful. You can just call them MACPAC. So MACPAQ. It's a partnership via Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland. They've worked with the state of Maryland to assess appropriateness of care for elective PCIs. And we are, again, revamping our process with a couple pilot centers who will work to upload their films and have blinded external review to assess agreement between imaging and pathology for these PCI patients. We'll provide a detailed list with a number of pieces of information, which I believe are on one of the next slides, including percentage stenosis, appropriateness, outcomes, etc. And then we'll also have the ability to link this data back to the CathPCI registry for some more detailed analytics. So this is just a brief look at the upload process. We'll have a way of getting the list of elective patients to MACPAC, who will reach out to the centers directly for the uploads. Hospitals will have a secure way of uploading their angiographic films. They will be blinded and then reviewed by the external reviewers. And MACPAC will then send the data back to VCSQI for our summary analysis. We will share individual site level data, patient level data with each center, as well as aggregate VCSQI information. And here's a quick look at the variables. It's a 29 segment model for PCI location. Visual stenosis will be assessed in 10% increments, and they will let us know whether they felt the procedure was appropriate, maybe appropriate, or rarely appropriate. We'll again have the ability to go back to NCDR and compare the reviewers' assessments alongside the clinical data that has been entered. So we're excited, and hopefully by next meeting we will have some initial data to present from MACPAC. Another piece we mentioned a couple times already this evening is our VHAC VCSQI statewide STEMI database. This is a quick schematic overview of how the data uploads will work. So whether you have the AHA Get With The Guidelines CAD platform, or if you have ACC and CDR's chest pain MI platform, we will re-merge or blend those two different data sources back into a unified database with ARMUS's help. And that will run primarily on the Get With The Guidelines format, just as the standard data model. ARMUS is working to develop some custom analytics. This is an overview of how the data will be uploaded and analyzed into the ARMUS system. This is actually a screenshot I took. It's already in ARMUS's hybrid platform, just a matter of getting the data now. I believe Dr. Shor mentioned we have 5 pilot sites who are already signed up. So as soon as we have data flowing in, we will have some reports to demo from our STEMI repository. These are the 5 metrics we've decided upon: FMC to balloon, median, and percentage less than 90 minutes, transfer time, door in, door out time, percentage of patients with pre-hospital EKG, and it was also mentioned actually this potential 6th metric, the percentage of COVID positive cases. Reports will be similar to what we see in VCSQI, similar to VHAC as well, where we'll look at regional data. These are the 6 VHAC regions on a previous slide. We'll compare hospitals, regions, and then against the VCSQI benchmark as well for each metric. So in terms of next steps, we are looking to sign data use agreements with all of our centers. Those have actually been incorporated into the current database agreements at no additional cost for current VCSQI sites. So if you're on this call, you want to participate, but you haven't signed that yet, again, we only have 5 centers, so please let us know. We are ready and raring to go and want to get this started ASAP. And this is just another little map with our current members. We have 28 members across the state right now, and potentially would want to bring this to everybody, so including about 15 new PCI centers as well is the goal for our statewide STEMI repository. Next up, we have our summary of CathPCI measures. So the latest data is updated through Q3 2020. We're looking at standard ACC metrics with the caveat that concomitant CABG procedures are excluded, just to provide a little bit more standard of a patient population. We are grouping hospitals into three different brackets: low, medium, and high volume, based on the number of PCIs you'll see at the bottom of your screen here. Before we get to program level data, this is just an overall look at our statewide procedure volume. In blue, we see the raw number of PCI cases, and in orange, the STEMI for PCI volume. See the big spike here in April of 2020. Obviously, that's the big COVID drop, nearly a 40% drop in overall statewide volume. For total PCIs, about a 18 to 20% drop in STEMIs. However, bounced right back up in May, not quite to pre-COVID levels, but less than 10% of a drop as compared with 2019 in the same period of time. So slowly but surely, things got back to normal. We have yet to see what the fall and winter data looks like here, so that's a bit of a caveat. Feel free to stop me with any questions, comments, concerns, by the way. Next up, we are looking at vascular access site by hospital. So you'll see codified on the bottom are the VCSQI center names. Again, low volume on the left, medium volume in the middle, high volume on the right. This first view shows the proportion of femoral and radial cases by center. So the VCSQI state average is about 61% radial, just under 40% femoral, but a wide variation. Some centers are doing over 90% radial, others are still about 75% femoral. So a lot of potential for standardization here. We realize there is a difference in terms of patient population. The femoral patients are generally sicker on average. You'll see here, not only are they about twice the average predicted risk based on the NCDR's classification, there is a lot more variation by hospital as well. For radial, you see it's pretty flat down here at the bottom. Everybody's within about half a percentage point of one another. But for femoral, they kind of bounce around all over the place. Some are 1%, some are 4%, again, on average. The next set of graphs look at outcomes by access site. So in general, we see femoral patients having about twice to 3 times the rate of complications as opposed to radial patients. First is observed bleeding by center. We're at 4% for femoral, 2% for radial. But a lot of variation between sites here. In general, though, even if a site has a high femoral rate, they might have a high radial rate, but their femoral is higher. I'll pause a minute just to give folks a chance to find your center and to soak in some of the information here too. Next, we have red blood cell or whole blood transfusion, again, broken down by access site. You'll see transfusion rates are almost 3 times the radial population in the femoral group. Interestingly, some centers aren't using blood for anyone. So R2 has a 0% transfusion rate across both. Other centers are using more blood than the average in both groups. So definitely some varying transfusion practices here. Here we see the composite indicator of death, emergency CABG, stroke, or repeat target vessel revascularization. Again, we have about twice the incidence of this event in the femoral group versus radial. Across the board, it seems like femoral has higher rates with just a couple exceptions. Although again, we saw higher risk patients as well in the femoral population. So next up, I guess we could risk adjust this graph too, potentially. This is fluoroscopy time greater than 60 minutes by hospital. The VCSQI average for femoral patients is 3% versus just under 1% for radial. Here we see that almost no centers are using fluoro time greater than 60 minutes in the radial population, especially in the lower and intermediate volume groups. It's a much more common practice, though, for femoral patients. Again, this might have to do with the higher acuity of patients we're looking at in that group. The piece that was discussed earlier was length of stay. Femoral patients aren't quite twice the radial length of stay, but they are about a day longer on average. That's pretty consistent across the board. AKI was also mentioned as a focus earlier. The next couple graphs show AKI rates by VCSQI center. first is for all PCI cases without cabbage. You'll see we're just a hair above the NCDR's average, 7.6 versus 6.2. Some of our programs are below the NCDR benchmark, but a number of our high volume sites are greater than that 6% benchmark. This might have something to do with the denominator here. You'll notice actually up in the right-hand corner, the overall N, went forward too fast. The overall N has decreased by about 35 to 40% here. That's due to the patients without pre and post procedure creatinine being excluded from the population. So it's a bit of an apples and oranges metric, and there's some difficulty measuring this rate here, but based on the data we do have, we do see, again, a fair amount of variation of AKI performance.
Eddie, this is Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I don't know how long you've been collecting the data, but it might be interesting to look back and see if there's been any change in people moving from femoral to radial with you being able to show these outcomes.
Great point, Chris. The rate of radial cases has increased over time.
Okay. Are there certain, I guess,
of AKI on that shift?
Okay, I was just wondering, like, if there were centers that, had saw the data and then made changes in their practice.
And whether that impacted the AKI rate.
Right.
It also would be interesting because there are practices where they don't draw the creatinines, and how much that has changed over time as well. Because that will really impact the numbers.
Yeah, at Winchester, they actually changed their practice to doing more creatinines because they saw that our AKI rate was, they felt maybe falsely elevated because they were only doing creatinines on patients they suspected had AKI.
Yeah, that's true at UVA too. We were only checking in the high risk for AKI patients, and so your denominator wasn't all patients, and so made our rate look higher.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to track the number of cases and the number of, based on the other data and the actual number of AKI data points and how it has varied over time.
Great points. We will take a look at that for our next call.
Does anybody track the AKI with transfusion? On the centers that are transfusing more, is their AKI rate able to be separated out and compared with those that transfuse less?
Eddie, don't you have that slide?
I do. Dr. Spear, we did look at that as part of our AKI work group. Give me 1 second and I will pull that up. But the transfusion rates, or sorry, the AKI rates in the transfused patients are much higher than the non-transfused population.
I thought it was in this slide deck, maybe not.
Because that may track back to access. If you're transfusing more with femoral access and your AKI rate is higher, is that another motivating factor to alter access site?
This is the overall analysis we did in terms of AKI and new dialysis by transfusion group. So transfusion is on the bottom here, yes and no. So if you didn't get blood, your AKI rate was about 6.3%. If you did get blood, your AKI rate was almost 45%. So we can break this down by centers that transfuse more or less, but in general, seems like a pretty clear correlation with transfusions and AKI.
Don't you think it's because you're getting blood because you are bleeding and you're hypertensive and then you get AKI, right? Not the blood itself.
That would be the knee-jerk response, but there are, at least in the surgical population, there were a number of centers that were transfusing by a hematocrit number rather than patients were symptomatic. You may have in your center a crit threshold of 27 as opposed to 19. And so in terms of cause and effect, there's a direct correlation with just transfusing and stroke and AKI and more other morbidities. So you may want to separate that out if you can, and not assume that it's related to those patients that were hypotensive or tachycardic and all those other things. Some folks just transfuse because of the number.
That's probably less common in the cathing world, but certainly something we should look at. The other is, Eddie, whether we can pull up whether blood pressure is included to see whether that's a correlate. Someone gets hypotensive and develops ATN and then AKI.
That's a tough one because I don't know any of the databases that actually pull that.
Yeah, that was.
Yeah, I think we only have pre-procedure blood pressure in the CathPCI. So great discussion, and Gyula actually will delve into AKI and prediction of factors that are associated with that in some of his slides later as well. I wanted to go back though to a couple of these graphs here from our CathPCI database. So AKI by access site, we saw about a 50 to 60% increase in the AKI rate in the femoral population versus radial. Part of this again has to do with the risk of the population, but we did some sub-analysis earlier that showed regardless of risk group, femoral patients were seeing higher AKI rates. So Dr. Damer is leading the charge on that right now as far as drilling down on the effect of access site on AKI. So more to come on this one. Last couple of views here. This is another piece that was mentioned earlier in terms of same-day discharge, which you'll see in orange here. Varies greatly between centers. Some are doing it about 2/3 of the time or more. Other centers are hardly doing same-day discharges at all. So this would represent another opportunity to standardize care, also save costs too. This is just for elective PCI, by the way. And again, when we break this down by access site, you'll notice, again, a lot of variations, more same-day discharges, of course, in the radial population. Significant differences across both access sites here. All right, as always, your questions, comments, suggestions are greatly encouraged. They're mandatory, they're necessary for us to move forward on our data pieces. I'll extend that to Gyula's presentation too. So up next, we have the pleasure of Gyula Sziraczky from ARMUS Corporation, who will give us an update on the latest and greatest quality and clinical financial reports that ARMUS is working on. Gyula, I will pass you the screen here.
Thank you. Just 1 second. Can everybody see my screen?
Perfect.
Hello, everybody. It's been a while, so, not being able to sit in the same room and having a few bites and drinks, so just stuck with the Zoom meetings. Anyway, I think more than a year ago, obviously, because a year ago we didn't travel that much, we were talking about expanding our analytics and presentations, data presentation into machine learning generated reports. So in the next few minutes, I would like to share some of the results with you, emphasizing the fact that these are really, really preliminary results, and we're trying different kind of techniques and algorithms and approaches to help VCSQI members to achieve better quality and reduce costs, obviously. So let me just go through this few slides with you. And the first one is just an introduction of a modified version of the terribly named result by a machine learning algorithm called confusion matrix. And I put this together before using that results, and obviously I didn't get too much support to represent the data that way. So I changed this to a traditional format. Every one of these exercises and approaches start with data preparation. Turned out to be, over the last year, it's one of the most important and extremely difficult exercise to provide meaningful and good data to the machine to learn and giving us some kind of results. So for a while, we used the descriptive analytics and random forest methodologies in order to try to get something out of that massive amount of information. At this presentation right now, I'm using the STS data, and mainly because the CathPCI data, which we're doing, is in very, very early stage because of that kind of data engineering activity, which we commonly use that term to prepare data to the machine. So what you're seeing here is we're trying to use the postoperative AFib to predict postoperative AFib. For the reason we do that, so we can basically predict certain kind of outcomes, in this case, postoperative atrial fibrillation, and then use it for a while to figure out if this is the right methodology, right set of variables. In this particular area, we use the variables features, and I don't want to go into that route because it's very complicated and time consuming. But once we got that and we feel comfortable, we can move on to identify the most important factors of ending up with a postoperative AFib. And you will see the impact of these things, qualitative and financial wise. So what you're seeing here is the actual set. We used 2 years, I think, or 3 years, no, 2 years, no, 3 years of data without any rules, meaning that we did not say that this is a cabbage procedure or valve or anything else, just raw data to turn into machine learning data set and compare the result with the actual rates. So in this training set, this was roughly around 78% to 22%. So 22% of the cases ended up with atrial fibrillation. The machine random forest mechanism, approach gave us a matching rate of 14.5%, which was actually the machine predicted yes, and the actual data was also yes, and 62, which was the opposite. The false negative rate was 15.7, which actually predicted yes, but the value was predicted no, and the value was yes. And the false positive rate was the opposite, which we started focusing on that one result and see how can we reduce this to very, very minimal. So these four values give you the 100% of the results by the machine. So the next phase, we start using neural network concept, the neural network concept of the same data set. We also used data balancing methodology, which again is a concept which a data scientist can describe you much, much better than I would. But trust me, what I can tell you that because of the low percentage of the cases here, the machine would be favorably predict a no value instead of the yes value, so that we balance this data set into a relatively meaningful set for the machine. Didn't get much out of it. As you can see, the false positive rate actually tripled. So in that, the next step which we made was a switch to deep learning. And that one is really, really promising. So this is roughly around 2 weeks of working on these techniques. As you can see, the matching rate for no is extremely close to reality. The yes is very low, but because of the false negative rate, and the false positive rate is extremely low. So what we're gonna do next is to train the neural network with new rules and possibly new way of creating features from the variable set, the data set, to try to figure out what would be the best possible pre-data preparation, pre-learning data preparation to produce better results. So the next step after this one, which now we were very confident and positive about this, to go to identifying the main factors to prevent postoperative atrial fibrillation. And we're using these 3 or 4 different kind of statistical methodologies and the cross sections. So these are the very, very early stage to identifying the key factors. And the cross section of these key sections, color and deeper blue, represent the more influential of effect by this variable. So this is the next step. So why is this important? The financial impact of postoperative AFib is known by VCSQI members because of several other studies and presentation. But this one, I just would like to focus on the AFib and how can we get to the point where we comfortably, meaning the group comfortably can predict some kind of atrial fibrillation with the additional set of suggestions of what contribute the most to these outcomes. And as you can see here is that this is 3 years, cabbage only. And and I don't know why I didn't put this in. Oh, no, wait a minute, is that cabbage only? Yeah, I think it's cabbage only, I'm sorry. So 2,144 cabbage only, AFib only cases were among the AFib events. And these comorbidities are segmented to prolonged ventilation, renal failure, bleeding, dialysis, renal with dialysis, stroke, and re-op for other cardiac reasons. Total of 3,528. So the next line is that what happens if the members can reduce these complications by 10%, overall is 9% average, resulted 315 less cases altogether, and calculating the average cost of these groups ended up an estimated saving of $13.7 million in 3 years. Again, it's very early, but I think we're gonna have some very, very meaningful results and suggestions few months for both AFib and renal failure to identify the most common and most influential factors of preventing these postoperative events. So anybody has any question at this point?
Gyula, this is Alan. Thank you for this. I think it's, this is a great start, and certainly getting the slides and reviewing them with more time will generate a lot more questions. In those, you've picked those post-operative complications that have relevance: AFib, renal insufficiency, prolonged ventilation. But what about those that are more infrequent? Mortality at 2%, stroke rate 1.5 to 2%, those kind of things. Does this have to be volume-based, or will the predicted model be able to be validated despite the infrequent occurrence?
This is a very, very important question, Alan. We have run multiple prediction models for events which has algorithm by the STS. The reason we picked post-op AFib, because there isn't any. That's number one. Secondly, we would like to, again, go to the point where we can identify the most important and most evidence, the most influential factors which produce this post-operative event. The renal failure, which is relatively low, mortalities is in the study stage right now. We passed the prediction modeling because we have enough evidence of the prediction by using the STS prediction models and numbers. And I'm probably going to be able to produce some kind of result in 3 months for the next quarterly meeting, focusing on those events. And as Mike mentioned before, that there's a really, really strong interest of figuring out renal failure and AKIs. So we're doing this. But this one, the reason we do this on, because we really wanted to feel comfortable of the pre-analytical process, meaning turning the data which we have into an analyzable format. And that's a very, very difficult and extremely time-consuming exercise. It's not just time-consuming by us, but for the machine as well. So this deep learning techniques runs for sometimes several days, if not weeks, before it comes up with something. Obviously, we're not using Google at this point to run these numbers, because that would be very, very expensive for us. But we are in the process of having an agreement with Google to be able to make these things much more economical for us and for you as well. So we are moving into that. And another thing is that the preparation for the data, again, is important. But when we start with 2 or 3% event rates, then it's much, much more difficult to use that to justify some kind of data balancing pre-study wise. So that's why we choose the AFib. But there's certain things that are going in parallel, several areas, and in cardiology and cardiac surgery as well.
This prediction is huge, because what we haven't done to date is have that population of patients that we could anticipate the postoperative morbidities, whether it's renal insufficiency or frailty, pulmonary insufficiency, that we would then alter our treatment schedule in order to pre-treat them.
Yes.
And for those that are clinically stable enough to do it, is that what patient population needs a more aggressive pulmonary approach, hydration and diuretics, or what do we do? Stopping some of the renal nephrotoxic meds, stuff like that. But because we've really never explored this, so I think what we could do.
And it's so important for us to know this, but obviously we are not physicians, not surgeons, not domain experts in that area. So once we get to that point, and that's why these exercises are important, that we feel comfortable about data preparation and really quickly change focus on analytics to different areas, we have to bring in people from VCSQI and other areas who can help me with this kind of information you just mentioned, and create an application out of this exercise, which would help you tremendously for preparation of the patients, obviously for the not the emergency, what is the other one, the elective cases as well. Yes, so it's coming. So once we have the engineering part of this and the data science out of this, domain experts needs to be involved with us, because we cannot do that otherwise.
Thank you,
Gyula,
Gyula.
this looks great. Thank you very much. And we look forward to next steps as this gets developed as huge upside and potential for our patients and systems. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'm really, really honored to be able to work with you guys and with the data. This is a big, big issue in the science world. People don't have information. By the way, we're using de-identified data for this, and this is only VCSQI, and no patient information involved here. The system which we created before anything else to automatically de-identify data independently of where it came from. And we're focusing on one single data version at this point, because again, it just add extra complexity of the cases. So one more quickly, because we're running out of time. The next one is I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Where you have another presentation as well. So
yeah, just one slide, which I would like to show. So this is it's an interesting concept. What we did is to have clinical outcomes affect the cost, not just overall cost, but the distribution of cost, where you spend your money in certain situation. This is very simple at this point. It's going to be available. Eddie and Sherry and I talked about this to put this presentation in a video format where members of VCSQI can stop by when they can see their own hospital and see how they compare to others, because anonymously. So what you're seeing here is the no post-operative events, distribution, cost distribution, and any other event. The numbers, the dollar numbers, are VCSQI numbers, and that's the ranking. So where you spend most of the money. That's VCSQI average compared to every members. And this one here is providing the percentage of no post-operative event cases versus the amount of money spent for these 63% of 52% of the dollar spend of the overall cost in here versus 37% of the any post-event group, 40 to 48% of the total cost. These numbers belong to this 52%, so $65 million. So when you click here, you can see the different kind of hospitals, and the distribution changes not just compared to the VCSQI, but between the two groups. So we have this for 2018 and 2019, and pretty soon going to be 2020 up in the middle of the year. So I stop here. It's going to be available on the VCSQI website, and you're going to be able to review this on your own speed.
Wow,
Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you, Gyula. That's really amazing.
Thank you. How can I stop this? I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, I already did that. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gyula.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Gyula. And again, these data will be available on VCSQI.org. They're making use of the latest and greatest cost calculations. ARMUS has done a great deal of work in the back end to revise the cost algorithms for surgery. So please be on the lookout for those when we send them out. And thank you again, Gyula, for all your hard work here.
You're welcome. Really enjoyed that.
Okay.
So up next, we have our anchor segment here. We have Ms. Chris Seitzma, Director of Outcomes at Winchester Medical Center. And Chris, is Dr. Breckville with us too?
She's not going to be able to make it, no. So I will be the lone survivor here.
Chris, take it away, please.
Okay, if I try to share screen.
Yes, we can see. I think.
Yeah, you want to load it, or I can load it for you, Chris? I will load it, and just tell me when you want me to advance to the next slide.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Well, guys, you know, I'm always honored to speak to the VCSQI, and kind of like being the last speaker of the night is like being the speaker right before lunch. Everyone has an exit strategy. So I have done this presentation in 15 minutes, so that probably will be my goal and give you time for questions. So I am Chris Seitzman, I'm the Director of Outcomes at Winchester Medical Center. Marcia Brackbill as a PharmD. Dr. Brackbill has worked with me on other projects, and she's actually presented at the VCSQI at Shenandoah University School of Pharmacy. She's unable to make it tonight. Her son's having his birthday, so I said I'd do it alone. So the next slide will say that we have nothing to disclose. Next slide. Well, when I first presented this to the Research and Writing Committee, I think they might have asked why this and why now. Next slide. Well, one of the reasons is that this topic actually approaches, I'm sorry, back one. Okay, this actually covers cardiology, one more. Okay, this covers, we have an addition of cardiology now to the VCSQI, and a lot of the recommendations from amiodarone and atrial fibrillation actually come from the ACC, the AHA, the Heart Rhythm Society, and the SPS. Next slide. So briefly, a little bit about amiodarone prophylaxis. In 2001, the ACC-AHA guideline for the management of patients with AFib said that it is a Class 2A Level B recommendation that you administer sotalol or amiodarone prophylactically to patients at increased risk for developing postoperative AFib. In 1997, Dowd actually did a lot of publication about amiodarone and AFib, and he found that if you had decreased AFib, if you had AFib, you had a significant increased length of stay. If you were able to decrease arrhythmia, you had a decrease in atrial fib, your costs were better, and you had a reduction of ventricular rate. Next slide. So just briefly looking down memory lane from 2003, so 2003, the VCSQI really started working on a PI project for amiodarone as prophylaxis for the prevention of atrial fib and heart surgery. And we were there awarding the best practice of Inova, who actually published their work. Also in 1991 and 99, the guidelines for the management of patients with atrial fib were published by the STS. So next slide. So what was the VCSQI doing in 2003? We actually looked at the best performers in the VCSQI, and you saw 5 sites that actually outperformed the VCSQI in post-op atrial fib, and the VCSQI outperformed the STS. So we were wondering, what are these sites doing? We do know that the best performer had amiodarone prophylaxis. Next. So what was the VCSQI doing? Actually, in 2004, myself and Dr. Brackbill actually presented on amiodarone prophylaxis. And in 4 and 5, there was a strategy identified by the VCSQI. Now, the problem was the adoption of the protocol was very inconsistent. Some sites feared that they didn't have a 5-day loan to get a patient uploaded. Some wanted only using it 1 day. There was concerns of bradycardia. There were concerns of pulmonary toxicity. And some sites even just wanted to give an IV dose post-op. So why were these varying results? Why? Next slide. So what I actually did is about the same time, the VCSQI was publishing on incremental cost of these post-op complications. For atrial fib, the cost was about $3,000 per patient. And if you had atrial fib and one other complication, it was around $9,000. And Gyula just spoke about this cost of complications. Next slide. In 2006, they actually revised their guidelines, and it now moved to a Class 2A Level A. It said the preoperative amiodarone administration reduces the incidence of atrial fib in patients undergoing cardiac surgery. And it actually represented prophylactic therapy for patients at high risk. Around the same time, there was a publication of the Papa Bear trial that looked at amiodarone and atrial fibrillation, and a meta-analysis of 19 different studies concluded that there was a body of evidence suggested that prophylactic amiodarone should actually be routine therapy, not just high risk for patients undergoing cardiac surgery. And again, in 2005, the Society of Thoracic Surgeons continues to publish their publication. Next slide. And we're marching on to 2014, and it continues to say that amiodarone administration reduces the incidence of AFib in patients undergoing cardiac surgery. And here again, though, it did say for prophylactic therapy at high-risk patients. Next slide. Okay, so who was high risk? I do want to congratulate and thank Mary Washington for their slide when they presented to the VCSQI on who was high risk. Atrial fib patients with MAVE, sternal reentry, STEMIs, COPD valve patients, renal failure, especially with dialysis, congestive heart failure patients, especially with the low EF, and sepsis. And the one now that we're adding is obesity itself is gaining traction in the literature as an independent determinant of new onset atrial fib after cardiac surgery. Next slide. Okay, so this is just some of the articles that I looked at preparing for this talk. And as you see in the forefront, they are the two articles that I was fascinated by looking at obesity and the high risk of and the risk of new onset atrial fib after cardiac surgery. Next slide. So now in 2019, the update for those guidelines said that the analyses suggest that perioperative amiodarone was safe. And it was puzzled because those guidelines said at the same time, the use of perioperative amiodarone remains limited in clinical practice. Why? No one could figure out why. So the next slide, this is what I asked Eddie to do. Next slide. Okay, this is what I asked Eddie to do. We approached the research and writing committee to kind of help us out to get a larger volume of patients. So we actually had isolated CABs, first CVA surgery from 2015 to 2019 in the VCSQI, and those 17,000 cases. But interestingly enough, if you looked even through, you see it in history where it's saying that amiodarone is safe, amiodarone prophylaxis is important, but look at the incidence of the use. The use of amiodarone over the years was consistent in the VCSQI at about 35%, and our use was about 28%. Just to let you know, we had a few more restrictions here. We looked at patients that did not have preoperative arrhythmias. They had to have amiodarone, and they had to be no MI. So ours was a little bit lower, but again, you see a consistent use despite the literature review. Now, SGS does collect this pre-op amiodarone, but it's not reported in their quarterly data review, so I could not put up here what it was nationally. Next slide. Now, in 2019, the update for the guidelines confirmed amiodarone, but interestingly, there was a new recommendation, and it was for weight loss. It was recommendation 7.13, and it said that obesity is associated with atrial electrostructural remodeling and atrial fibrillation. Looking at that, I kind of wondered, though, if we then decrease weight, can we help ourselves with atrial fib? Because isn't that remodeling already occurred? So that was just something in our background. Next slide. Now, obesity is a modifiable risk factor, and we know that. Well, they looked at the Framingham Heart Study, which actually provided the strongest evidence to date that obesity is an important predictor of development of atrial fib in adults. That obese individuals have a 50% increased risk, and BMI is one of the most powerful determinants of left atrial size and the left atrial enlargement, which is a precursor of atrial fib. For every 1 unit increase in BMI, there was a 5% increased risk of AFib in men and a 4% increase in women. So the next slide actually shows the latest data out of the 2020 SGS report, looking at the incidence of atrial fib by BMI. It's kind of like, I don't know why it's broke off there, guys. I don't know if you can see it. But the biggest change really occurred in overweight and obese number 1, which is a BMI of between 30 and 35. And you can see the incidence of AFib there is very high. Can you guys see the bottom of this? Because I cannot. Okay. Okay,
We
next slide.
can see down to morbid, the line that says morbid.
Okay, I can't see that at all. But I can also tell you that we did look at our own data, and the only area there was a significant increase of atrial fib was obese category 2. And these categories are the same as the World Health Organization and the same as the FCS. Next slide. Okay, so what about obesity and atrial fib? There's been some more documentation, and this is Zacharias, and he's actually my favorite. But he said that obesity has reached epidemic proportions in the United States and worldwide, which in turn raises the potential of it actually contributing to an atrial fib epidemic. He did his work actually in Toledo, Ohio, and he did his work over a 7-year period. Christo said that obesity is a worldwide health problem with epidemic proportions and has been associated with atrial fib, and several studies implicated obesity in the initiation and perpetuation of AFib. And a study in Denmark actually found a direct causal relationship between overweight and atrial fibrillation. So just when we thought we had it all figured out, go to the next slide. Then this guy Villarreal comes out, and he actually does work in Texas. So of course, everyone thinks that it must be right if it's done by the Texas heart people. So he had 10 years of study looking at amiodarone and atrial fib. And he said atrial fib patients actually had increased strokes, which we knew, prolonged hospital stay, worse in-hospital mortality, and up to 4-year post, and it was associated with ICU readmit, reintubation, persistent CHF, overall cost, renal failure, shock, respiratory failure, and infection. But his patients were less likely to be obese. They did not define the category of obesity, but these patients, what they did, were now less likely to be obese. So we got confused. Next slide. We did see that there were some weight guidelines in 2019 that we talked about. And we were worrying about this remodeling of the atrium, and we said, you know, if we bring down patients' weight, is it really going to make a difference? So I found a randomized controlled study that actually had a structured weight program for obese patients, and they define them as a BMI greater than 27, and they already had symptomatic AFib. And they found that they reduced the symptom burden and severity, reduced the number of AFib episodes and the duration, and that the degree of improvement was directly related to the degree of weight loss. There was a similar study actually showed the same improved outcomes for the AFib catheter ablation. So now what are we going to do? Next slide. Okay, so next slide. We partnered with Shenandoah University, and I've been so honored to work with Dr. Blackwell. She's amazing, and we've done a couple projects together. So in 19, we said, okay, let's take a look at this. Let's look at obesity, amiodarone, and atrial fib in bypass patients. It is unpublished. It was a single-site retrospective study of our patients, and we actually had some student involvement. So we just kind of made it pretty simple. We said, okay, patients obese, patients not obese, who has atrial fib, who doesn't? And darn it, we showed a trend toward lower atrial fib rates in obese patients, kind of like what Villarreal said. And we said, okay, so it was underpowered, unfortunately. We only had 50 out of 242 records that were included, and I'll talk a little bit more about our funnel on the next slide. So we said, oh, okay, so where's that coming from? Does that now mean that amiodarone is somewhat protective against atrial fib? It stores in fat. Is it released over a longer period of time? So now the patients don't get atrial fib. So we did our second study, and this was the obesity as a pharmacokinetic factor in patient response to amiodarone. Next slide. This is what we appealed to the research and writing committee to help us out, because we said we needed a larger sample size. And we knew that the characteristics of amiodarone was that it was highly protein bound, but we knew it had a high affinity for adipose tissue. So we thought to ourselves, okay, so now the obesity patients with amiodarone are protected against atrial fib because the adipose tissue releases it over time and you get the drug in there longer, and that's what's happening. So now we figured that that was going to be our hypothesis. Next slide. So the study purpose was to evaluate patients' outcomes in regard to their BMI. Next slide. We did a retrospective cohort study, and it was data from the VCSQI database. Patients were included if they had isolated tabs. They had to have amiodarone pre-op and up to 5 days, but that was hard to quantify. As you guys know, if you collect the data, it's just not in there. They were excluded if they had a ventricular atrial arrhythmia, prior MI, prior cardiac surgery, or was off pump. And the patients were simply divided into 2 study groups, less than 30 or greater than or equal to 30. Next slide. Primary endpoint was the incidence of AFib in post-op CAB patients who received perioperative amiodarone who were obese compared to non-obese. Again, we just had those 2 categories. Secondary endpoints were ICU length of stay, post-op length of stay, 30-day readmit, and mortality. Next slide. Okay, to the right, let's take that real quick. We didn't have a whole lot of difference between our study groups, except for, as you can imagine, in weight and BMI. Both of them had a high percentage of males in these categories. White patients were in the VCSQI 77 to 71%. More hypertension did occur in the study group too, but both of them were pretty high and high for this dyslipidemia. But let's take a look at the left. We ended up with 17,800 patients. We were so excited. We got down to our exclusions and we ended up with 15,717. We were even more excited. And we did final pass and we ended up with 2,088 patients. The first time we saw this came from our students. So of course, being people that we are, we're like, well, the students must not have done this correctly because there's no way that that is all the patients that you can have in this large sample size. So we were supposed to present to the writing committee a couple months ago and we pulled it because we said we've got to redo this. So indeed, we redid the entire exclusion of those patients, and wouldn't you know it, 2,088 patients was the answer. We thought we did pretty good by having 15 through 19, but when I looked back, in Texas, they actually went over a 7-year period, and Villarreal actually did 10 years. So next slide, what was the issue? What made that same large change? And we think it was this. Again, despite the incidence of amiodarone and atrial fibrillation information that's in the literature, we still do not see a high concentration of that given in the VCSQI or in the Winchester population. Next slide. So our endpoints, we did go ahead and put those up for you. We did have a significant statistical significance in length of stay for the ICU and overall, and in the three-day readmission, but not enough in our BMI for atrial fib. There was a slight tendency to the patients with atrial fib having, patients that are obese having atrial fibrillation. There was a slight increase in that, not statistically significant. Next slide. We were underpowered to make that to the statistical significance. We actually needed 2,800 patients. We also wondered, because we used older data that didn't adequately reflect current practices, maybe that's why we didn't see the difference. But in those other studies, they used even older data than we did. And as I showed you, the use of the amiodarone really didn't change over those 4-year periods. We're not able to quantify pre and post-op atrial fibrillation or amiodarone. Next slide. So, in conclusion, the use of amiodarone did not statistically significantly impact the incidence of atrial fib in obese patients compared to non-obese. But there may be an association between the incidence of AFib and weight, but further prospective studies would need to be concluded. And here's my baby, Mr. Zacharias, that challenged his colleagues. And he said, studies examining the efficacy of atrial fibrillation minimizing prophylactic interventions in high BMI patients, particularly in the elderly, may be warranted. Next slide. I would like to very personally thank the VCSQI Research and Writing Committee for their support. Next slide. And I want to give special recognition to Eddie Fonner, who helps with the data procurement at a drop of a hat. And it was a pleasure to talk to you guys. I'll take questions, and there I go.
So that was lovely. How have you changed your practice there then? What have you done to implement changes?
Currently we haven't done anything, specific. We did have a period of time where we had taken off the amiodarone based on one of our physicians, and we did see an uptake in atrial fibrillation, so we went back to amiodarone. But looking at the obese patients, you know, we're not sure where to go with that. You know, it's in the literature. It says that obese patients have, you know, a higher incidence of atrial fib. So you kind of wonder, should they get higher doses of amiodarone? I don't know. We know that we were disappointed in the funnel, you know, going from 17,000 to 2,000 was very disappointing to us. When we talked to the research and writing committee, there was a suggestion, you know, should we expand it to the Maryland group and to Michigan and Washington State? And definitely by then, I think we'd have to get enough patients to be powered. So I don't know. I don't know where we're going to go from here.
Chris, great job. There's a question in the chat from Nancy at UVA. She asks, is OSA a data element in STS, and would it be interesting to see if obesity and OSA increased risk versus obesity alone?
Right. I thought about that as well. Guys, I'm not so familiar with the sleep apnea in the adult cardiac. I think I'm doing LAAO. I don't know, guys. If you can help me out, is that an element?
And Beth wrote in chat, actually, OSA is an element.
Yeah, I thought it was an STS. You know, we're kind of limited too with this amiodarone now. The STS doesn't report it, so if we have to do some work, we'd have to appeal to them. And then the dose of amiodarone, you know, that's just not been something that they've looked at real strongly in the STS database. Yeah, thanks, Beth. I thought it was an element, but I'm always afraid to. Yeah, I know the BMI is up there. That was easy for us. Okay, thank you.
Any questions or comments for Chris? Thank you again, Chris. Great work, and we will keep the dialogue going. A reminder to everybody as well that the Research and Writing Committee is open to all VCSQI members, so we need your proposals. We desperately want to work on new projects with you all, so please reach out if you're interested in working with us on any projects like this. Thanks again, Chris. Dr. Shor, can I pass it back to you for closing remarks, maybe some quick thoughts on future directions?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for their contributions. It's really very, very exciting. It's been a challenging year with COVID and all of the other attendant stresses, political, social, et cetera. So thanks to everyone. I would personally say make sure you have time for self-care. Being able to be resilient in this very challenging time is extremely important. Having said that, for the foreseeable future, we will continue with the board direction, the virtual meetings. We have a lot of exciting initiatives and the input from members directing how we and where we put our energies is a direct line. So thank you all very much. People that are interested, there are a lot of emails or in the chats. If Eddie, you can send those links out or Sherry, the links out to everyone. So if they want to either participate or fill out the surveys, that would be great. And other than that, thank you very much. Alan or others on the board have any other comments? Eddie, Sherry? Thank you very much. What a great picture.
Yes, it is.
Thanks, everybody. Hope you all get out and enjoy the lovely spring weather. And take care. Thanks, everybody, for being with us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.